John, I have a question over here.
Yes.
This film was the next best effort to having Penny here. I'm sorry she can't travel anymore. But why, given the fact that Disney had made this blockbuster film on Secretariat and Penny's life, why did you feel that you wanted to do this documentary?
Well, Penny's, first of all, Secretariat's story is this mythic thing that occurred. It was this eruption of perfection into Mom's life and into our life and our family. And I think Mom spent the better part of the last 40 years since it's happened living up to the horse. And, you know, as her father lectured her, don't embarrass the horse. He was a hard horse to live up to. And so her sense of her own story was very much maybe burdened, maybe inspired, maybe pressured into creating a persona that would match and live up to Secretariat. And I think as her life went on, and then as the Disney movie came along, the Disney movie was a wonderful movie, and we were very proud of it, and my mom collaborated with Diane Lane and with the scriptwriter and had a terrific experience, we all did. And it was a Disney movie. You know, I mean, it's definitely Disney has a formula for telling sports stories, and it fit into that. And in some ways it left, as you probably can see from watching the documentary, pieces of her life completely unaddressed. And so I think it created in her sort of a hunger to tell more of her story, to say, you know, if you're interested in me, I'm not a Disney princess, you know, and my story is not a fairy tale. And so that, I think, the pressure in her was sort of building to tell her own story in some way. And then when the Disney movie came out and she'd go to these signing opportunities and people would come up and just weep and tell her what a tremendous role model she was and a tremendous mother and a tremendous person. You know, it created an internal pressure in her and also in the family, and then created an opportunity. So then we started to have conversations, and when she turned 90, I had, my father had died somewhat young, and I had not done an oral history with him before his death, and so I was really committed to doing one with Mom. And so we did a round of interviews in about 2002, and those are the standard definition ones that you see with her in front of the cabin. And she had a version of her life and a self-concept of what her story was at that time, that then when we decided, okay, we're going to make this documentary, the Disney movie happened in between those two times. And so then when I re-interviewed her in 2012, her story was much more candid and more revealing and more willing to just say, you know, I don't have anything to hide anymore. I don't have anything to prove, and I'm going to tell you how it was. And I also had grown up a little bit more in that time. You know, the dialogue between parents and children does evolve as parents age. And so there was an opportunity for a deeper conversation than we'd ever had before. And so those were the two elements that made it into kind of a more candid story than it would have been if we had tried to make the documentary back in 2000. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, you hear the voiceover basically saying how unhappy your mother was in her marriage, yet your father seems to be with her at all of the events. I'm wondering, did they ever get divorced? Because I noticed at the end she used her maiden name.
Right. They did divorce in, and I realize now that it's on the festival circuit, this is sort of an ambiguity in the film that I kind of wish I'd cleaned up. They did divorce in the fall of 1973. But up until that point, up until the time they decided to divorce, they observed the social conventions of husband and wife, and he showed up for every race. And, you know, I thought when I looked at the footage of him and Lucian and Penny in the box at the Belmont, the sort of, from a journalistic standpoint, delicious, but from a personal standpoint, excruciating tension that's going on there while the horse is putting in the greatest performance in history was just, you know, that was part of the reason that I really felt that the relationship with Lucian was, as filmmakers say, on the through line. This is something that really was essential information to the story in order to really understand what she was experiencing and going through at that time. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I have two questions, simple questions. The first is, you showed some early footage of Secretariat as a 2-year-old in that where he broke from the gate and the 2 other jockeys kind of went into him. Do you know if that, I mean, I know they do intentional things. Were they threatened by Secretariat?
No, Quebec, the horse that Jacinto Vasquez was on who did a left turn, 2-year-olds do crazy things. And Quebec, of course, was a separatist horse. And he just came out, and 2-year-olds really are goofy. They can be really goofy. And he came out and did a left turn, and he was, bye.
The other question I have is that, why did Lucian Warren not tell Ron Turcotte why he had the abscess?
I have no idea. I'll give you, okay, here's my theory. He never even told Penny the horse had an abscess. I'm sitting after the horse's career was over, and I'm having 3 long tape-recorded interviews with Penny. This was in the fall. And I said to her, I said, now tell me about what you know about the abscess. And she looked at me blankly and said, what abscess? I said, the abscess he had in his upper lip before the Wood Memorial. She said, I know nothing about that. I said, you don't know about that? She said, no. I said, well, she said, let me check with Lucian on that. So the next time I met her, I said, did you check with Lucian about the abscess? She said, yeah, he denied it. He said there was none. Well, I got it from Dr. Emmanuel Gilman, who lifted his lip that morning. He told me about it. Dr. Copeland treated the horse's abscess when he went to Kentucky, in Louisville. He gave me an hour-long interview in which he described how hot packs were put on the lip, and he was going to have to lance it if it didn't break by the Thursday before the race. And it was touch and go. He was going to have to cut it. But they actually, Eddie Sweat put compresses on it and actually got the seed to come out of the thing. And but Lucian, to the day he passed, denied that that horse ever had an abscess. And I think the reason is because he grew up in the leaky roof circuit of horse racing, and such information like that was valuable. And you never, ever shared that with anybody. You didn't tell your owner. You didn't tell anybody about something like that. And he just decided, maybe he forgot about it. Maybe he was in denial. I don't know.
I have one other data point about that. I don't know the answer either, but after Secretariat's loss in the Wood, Penny and Lucian had an absolute screaming match fight. And she was extremely blameful towards him, loosed upon him her famous temper. And it was actually, I think, that fight and the aftermath of it that led to their further intimacy, which began right around that time. And and that's not an uncommon story, right? You might think, and I've speculated that the fight they had and Lucian's inability to explain to Mom and his decision not to reveal to her, even in the crucible of that argument, that the abscess had occurred, just buried it for him. And he never, that was his story, and he was sticking to it, that there was no abscess. So that's the only, that's another explanation. Whether it's right or not, I don't know. Lucian was an incredibly courtly, wonderful man. I like the Disney movie a lot, but the John Malkovich was not Lucian Warren. And he was a classic Disney sidekick in the way it was portrayed in the movie, the way the candlestick in Beauty and the Beast, or the crab in Little Mermaid is the wisecracking, savoir-faire is everywhere kind of person. And Lucian was just not that. He was a great man.
What happened to him?
He died in 1990?
Yeah, he died during surgery, I believe for a broken hip or something. He never came out of surgery.
Back up there, top row.
It's really, I'd like to share a Secretariat story with you. I was at Belmont in '73. We're in Kentucky, and we go to the Claiborne Farm, and there is Secretariat is coming down, being led down to the back. Oh, I put my hand out, and he snakes around and bites me. I thought I was going to sue. And instead, I was sort of kicking it, hoping I'd get a skull car.
That's great.
And who has love affair stories with this horse? That's what's so interesting. Anybody want to share another one?
Jack Nicklaus, the golfer, said to Haywood Hale Broun after the Belmont, he said, you know, Haywood, I don't know anything about horse racing. I'm a golfer. And he said, but I don't understand why during the Belmont Stakes, I was home alone in Boca Raton. Barbara was out with the kids. And I was on, as the horse turned for home, I found myself on my hands and knees on the den floor, pounding on the rug as that horse came through the stretch. And he said, tears were rolling down my cheeks. And I have no idea why I reacted that way. And Haywood Hale Broun said something very sage. He said, Jack, he said, your entire life as a golfer has been a search for perfection, and you saw it. And Nicholas said, you know, that makes sense. And the second thing is that, anybody ever heard of Pete Rozelle? The old NFL commissioner, very distinguished. He made the NFL what it is today. He went to the races, and during the Belmont, as the horses turned for home, Pete said, I was at Belmont up in the dining room, and he said, I'm watching this horse, and all of a sudden, somebody grabs the cuff of my pants. And I thought somebody had collapsed at my feet. And I looked down, and I saw that I was standing on the dining room table. And he said, I have no idea how I got up there. Anyway.
There's a question right in there.
In your mother's life, was she aware of what was happening over there in society for women?
She was very aware. She didn't espouse the rhetoric of feminism. She didn't consider herself a women's liber, as the terminology of the day. And her approach to to her struggle as a woman, because I think I think her story very much embodies the social trajectory of women in World War II, leading up to World War II, in World War II, then being sort of shunted back aside out of the workforce, told to go back to the kitchen. I mean, that was her life. That was her generation. She lived it. So, I mean, all of that was you know, she didn't have to have anybody tell her that, but it was useful for that vocabulary to be out there. But the way she responded to it was to ignore the fact that she was a woman, sort of. I mean, that was her story about it. I don't think she ignored the fact that she was a woman. I think that she used her femininity and expressed her persona as a woman very effectively. But she didn't. She commanded respect. She wielded power. She found that her anger was useful. One of the things she had to do, it's a story that is told in the Disney movie that's sort of true, was that she had to fire her father's trainer early on when she took over the stable because he was doing transactions with the horses that were not kosher. And so she claimed her power, took over the stable, you know, dressed down who she needed to, and was effective at it. But yeah, she was very much a creature of that time. And you had a question right behind you.
As a mother myself, I thought it was very interesting that you talked and you asked your mother about her anger. And, you know, that you were able to do that. And she realized, you know, she wasn't really, you know, she wasn't angry at you or your brothers and sisters. And being the women's movement too, it was also, you know, the Vietnam War and the turmoil in the country, and it was great that we had Secretariat to take time away from that. But how did you and your siblings grow up with all of that swirling? And did you just show up at the races, or were you interested?
So I went to the track with her quite a bit in 72, 73, and coming from Colorado. My father had been involved in the ski industry. We'd gone to Vail every weekend. I was a skier. I knew nothing about New York. I knew nothing about horse racing, really. Was learning a lot. And suddenly, we're in the trustees' room at Belmont Park. And it was the biggest culture shock experience that it was a mind blower for me. But I learned a tremendous amount, and the impact on Mom's anger of having this outlet was really a relief for her and for us, because the worst years of her rage were in the mid to late 60s, when she didn't have that outlet, and all of the social dislocation that you were talking about was happening, and there was no way out, and she was volcanic. And that was scarring for all of us, and her too. I mean, she wasn't proud of it. We were scared of it. It was terrible. And then when she began to have an outlet, then things eased up. And of course, the marriage didn't survive it. And when she finally announced that they were getting divorced, there was relief among the family more than anything else.
I felt her wrath. And I'd hung around the barn I'd been there since Riva Ridge, and I was sort of a fixture. I got there every morning from March until all through April into May, and doing this. I was there and doing other things, but I would show up at the barn and spend time in the afternoon, and nobody ever questioned my legitimacy there. And all of a sudden, I had this notebook full of stuff, and somebody told me at the Newsday, they said, you got enough to write a book. And I said, gee, I hadn't even thought of that, And next thing I know, one of the guys at Newsday had fixed me up with a publisher in New York. And I went there in April. And I'd never written a book. I had 4 kids, like 4 hungry birds in a nest, with stretching their necks out all the time. And I didn't have time to write a book. I didn't know how to write a book. And guy said, oh, no, you got a really good book here if this horse wins this Triple Crown. And so before the Belmont, I told my publisher, I said, well, if he does win, I'll write the book, but I got to tell Penny. And the guy said, no, don't tell her. I said, I've got to tell her. He said, there's no reason. You're covering the horse for Newsday anyway, so tell her after the Belmont. I said, no, I got to tell her. So I told her. And the day after the Belmont, I was banned from the barn for 3 months because I was writing a book. And boy, she was hot. And she told Lucian, don't let anybody talk to him. Turcotte wouldn't talk to me. Sweat wouldn't talk to me. Lucian wouldn't talk to me. None of the grooms. I was totally banned from the barn. And I was really devastated. I couldn't believe it. Because I thought they were friends, but an illusion. But then later,
they thought you were a friend too.
Yeah, yeah, they thought I was a friend. But and so after a period of time, my publisher made a deal with Penny, and it worked out fine. But I realized after seeing this movie and working, and being around John and listening to these stories, that she really wasn't mad at me. She was just generally, this is the way she was. And she was, it didn't take much to tick her off. And I did. But, she got over it. I feel very tenderly to her right now. And I actually feel close to her. We're buddies now. I can call her on the phone, and I really feel like she's a friend.
Yes, sir.
I don't know if the Disney movie got this right, but before the Belmont, they made a big deal about choosing to train Secretariat hard rather than let him rest. One, is that what happened? And two, if so, given the performance in that race, has that changed how other horses are exercised or prepared for races or the Triple Crown?
Compared to how he was trained?
Well, in the movie they say we're going to push him hard because he wants to run, and he had that performance. Did that change the way people would train horses at all, or was that just Secretariat?
No, that was just him. He had an enormous, almost insatiable appetite for work. In fact, the harder you worked him, the faster he ran. Today, if you subjected a modern horse, to that kind of a regimen, he wouldn't last 2 weeks. They just are not as durable as they were, and this horse had cannon bones on him that were 2 inches thick. I mean, he looked like piano legs. Real thick, good bone, a deep bone, and he never took an unsound step in his life. When I see him walking on the film here in the paddock when they let him go, and he galloped, I was so sad. I still feel sadness because had Mr. Chenery lived another year, Instead of passing in January of 73, if he'd have passed in January 74 and they'd have syndicated him then, he'd have been a $10 million or $15 million horse, and he'd have run his 4-year-old year, and you would have seen something you had never seen before if you'd have thought his 3-year-old year was good. As a 4-year-old, as a fully mature horse, he'd have been unbelievable. But he was just a real freak of nature. Not only his heart was larger, but his bone was bigger, and he could withstand training and racing like no other horse.
There's a question over here.
Can I ask you about the film? Somebody mentioned it briefly. There's one moment in your second round of interviews with your mother where she says to you, I think there are still photos of the children in black and white against trees, and she says to you, I wasn't angry at you. It's such a deep moment for anyone who's been a parent or a child or ever had been yelled at or yelled at a kid. I wonder, was that fresh? Like, had you heard that from her before, or it was a very, very rich exchange between the two of you? I think we even hear your voice. Was that fresh, or was that something you'd heard of before?
That was fresh. That was something that her understanding of our experience with Secretariat was really evolving as a result of my sister Kate wrote a book about the meadow, the farm, and the history of the farm, and went out and marketed the book concurrently with the Disney movie being out in theaters. And so that was a good time to market the book, but the result of that experience for Kate was that all of these people would come up to her at signings and other experiences and just tell her what an incredibly wonderful childhood she had. And you know, it was toxic. It was very difficult for Kate over time to really hear that. And so then once that was reflected back to Penny, then that kind of created an opportunity for us to talk about, well, what was it really? Because it's a very difficult balance to try to articulate, because on one hand, I mean, no, I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me for having been the child of the woman who owned this incredible horse. It was a fantastic, amazing, mind-blowing experience, and there were these other dimensions to it that were traumatic and difficult. And how do you talk about that? And so the film was a great opportunity to explore that balance and to try to get that right, and to, because there are, of course, exposés out there by children of famous people, the sort of quintessential one being the sort of mommy dearest treatment, and that's a sort of cautionary tale if you're trying to do one of these projects. How do you avoid that, and how do you honor the legacy, and how do you tell? It was challenging, but that was a fresh conversation between us that I think we both really wanted to have because of what we were both experiencing.
You can continue talking with Bill and John in the lobby, so thank you very much.